I am happy to have today's guest on, not just because I was able to meet her in person and she's got great energy, but because she has a background in what we need, especially when it comes, here she is, to choosing a therapist for our children. So many of a lot of conflict and whoops, let me try it again. And we know that kids often need, here we go. There you are.
Hi.
Kids, hi. So kids need therapy and they need help processing what's going on. And so it's so important to understand what to know when it comes to choosing a therapist. But before you even introduce yourself, Himsa, why would AI never replace a human therapist?
Ooh, that's a great question. There are multiple reasons. So first is AI is trained to reply essentially what you're saying to it, right? So it's like spitting back information that you've given it in nicer words or more encouraging words. But there's something that is lost when it isn't a human, even through virtual. It can be it can't see the way you shift your body, and it can't
Mhm.
see the way you look away, and little things that therapists are trained to pick up on that indicate like uncomfortableness or wanting to not go into something. And that can be done with gentle pushing or creating space, but AI is not giving that. It's like an instant feedback of like, hey, it sounds like you're struggling, here are some things you can do to help, and it feels really good in the moment, but ultimately you're losing something without that human connection.
Yeah, and I think about something we bring up all the time called the 7-38-55% rule, and that's that people only really listen to 7% of your words, and that's all AI is getting. 38% is your tone, and 55% is your body language. So if you're thinking that AI can be your therapist, it's missing out on 93% of what actually
Literally.
matters in communication.
Yes. You're
Yeah,
also just creating an echo chamber too, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's only you. So even though therapists aren't telling you what to do necessarily, there's something dynamic in offering feedback in a way that they might not have heard it before, and
Yeah.
being able to sit with that. So yeah. Listen, I
And
think AI
also
is great in all kinds of
connecting though,
ways.
connecting like to
Yes.
a actual person. Yeah. So Himsa, why don't you now officially introduce yourself and tell
Sure.
us a little bit about your background?
Sure. My name is Ahimsa Luciano, and I am an art therapist in New York State. I have been working for, oh my gosh, I don't want to say a long time. I just realized how many years it was. And currently, I am the co founder and co owner of Pleasantville Wellness Group, which is a therapy group located in Pleasantville, New York. We offer services for kids through adults, through couples, through families. We do groups. And so we really have like a wide array of services that we provide. I, particularly, my background, I started my very first job was at a domestic violence and sexual assault agency, and I was the children's therapist. There was, of course, lots of trauma, but there was also, and I think this is where it comes into play of us speaking, there was a lot of really high conflict separations and divorces, sometimes tied to the domestic violence and sometimes not. Sometimes it was just so contentious that they came in. So I've had a long history of working with children and families who are having some real serious issues. So, and now I specialize more in more like high achieving women who are trying to balance parenting, successful careers, life, which is, aren't we all?
Yeah, yeah. So so why are one of the things, I mean, I remember when we first met you, you called yourself the puppy mill of agencies.
Oh no. My co-founder and I had worked at a group, and it was just I mean, it was just churning in and out clients, right? Like I would end with a client and there would be another one waiting, and I would end with that client, there would be another one waiting. When we opened up here, we tried to be really thoughtful and intentional about how we opened and giving therapists even 15 minutes in between clients, which is time to like stretch your legs, grab a drink of water, have a snack, do a note. Who knew? And it also helps a little bit with like burnout, right? Preventing burnout
Yeah.
when you're not just sitting there and just kind of like flying through everybody. But we tried to be a little bit more intentional.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it does help. I mean, you need to catch your breath, especially when you're doing so much focused, active listening.
Yeah, for sure.
So speaking of that, I mean, obviously you're experienced a lot more than many others, but why is an intake from an experienced provider so important?
It's a great question. The way we have our group set up is that Kelly or myself will do the intakes. We've both been in the field for well over 10 years, and there's something to be said for listening to the silence, or, kind of hearing in between the lines. Um, one of the intake questions we always ask is like, are you suicidal? Do you have any suicidal tendencies? And people are pretty honest, right? They're coming for therapy, but sometimes there's other things they're not ready to say. Like, I don't need your full history doing an
Hmm.
intake. I can understand that there's trauma there and that you might need something a little bit more intense, or perhaps there's trauma there and you are ready to do outpatient therapy. This is once a week therapy. It can't be something so serious that you need therapy 2, 3, 4 times a week, right? That's like a higher level of care. And so having the experience and having done intakes for so long, it gives us the ability to assess whether they're ready or in the place to do outpatient therapy. It also gives us a chance to connect them with the therapist we think they'll get the most out of, right? And by that I mean the most out of the therapeutic relationship, because really that's the most important thing and the biggest indicator of whether or not therapy is even going to be worth your time.
Yeah. So now let's think about when we're dealing with children and how a lot of times in these domestic violence situations or very difficult separations, divorces, whatever, custody
Mhm.
battles, kids are mandated
Yeah.
by the court, the court or a parent who really wants them to get into therapy. And they might not know how to do therapy. They might not be interested
Yeah.
in even being there. And one thing you had said was that it's really important for a therapist to give space to a child. How can a therapist even begin to start giving space to a child who has been, under this siege in their own home, which is supposed to be the safest place?
This is one of the things we do a lot of psychoeducation about, because listen, I get it. I have children. I want them to be the happiest and most secure and most confident, um, by any means necessary, right? It's hard to tell a parent it might take 3 months before they talk to me. And that's
Mhm.
okay, because what they're doing in that 3 months is building rapport, creating a safe space, letting the kid know, like, hey, I'm going to be here when you show up, and things are going to be pretty much the same. And we're going to move at your pace. You might have a kid who comes in and is like, oh my God, let me tell you about everything. Let me just start with this morning, right? Because there are some kids like that, younger kids, right? If you have a kid who's a little bit older, 10, 12, 15, and the family has been going through a really contentious divorce or separation, or things are really chaotic, they're not necessarily going to walk in and be like, let me tell you my biggest vulnerabilities. Let me tell you the things that I'm the most scared of. And that includes like something happening to my dad, something happening to my mom. I'm never going to be able to see one of them again. That's really scary stuff, right?
Mhm.
And to expect a child to come in and like, and I don't fault parents, I promise I don't, because I probably would want the same thing. They want them to be fixed right away,
Mhm.
fixed, whatever the what falls under that. And that's really hard. You have to give kids space. Some of the ways I used to give kids space and have, helped our connicians with is, I am an expert at Uno.
Uno.
An expert at card throwing,
Uh-huh.
Connect Four, those little games. And I think that that's part of the education that we help parents with. Like, yeah, it does look like we're playing games, but while we're playing, when kids' hands are distracted or they're busy doing something, there's a lot more of an opportunity for them to be like, oh, the last time I played Connect Four with my dad, he got really mad at my mom and he stormed off in the middle of it, right? Like, there's more space in letting kids get comfortable and at their pace to where they might really use the space for what it's meant for. And that's
Mhm.
hard. Listen, it's hard for a therapist. I had a client once, this poor kid, like, it was 9 months to get him into my office and shut the door. He was so scared of not being able to see his mom that, like, we sat in the waiting room for a really long time, and then
Mhm.
slowly and slowly, inched away, we would leave the door open, he would pop his head out, take a look. It really took him a long time. I mean, forget about talking, just to get him in
Mhm.
the room, right? And
Wow.
that's hard. It's hard to sit with that. I do think, and working at the agency I used to work for, when kids were mandated by the court, they did have a roster, let's say, of therapists who had experience with either domestic violence or, high profile or high contentious, separations. And that was helpful, I think, in finding the right therapist. Then it's just finding the fit, right?
Hmm.
And that's really hard to do with a kid because you might need them to go a month and then be like, I don't want to go anymore. And
Hmm.
it's not that they don't want to go, they might not want to go to that person, and that's okay, right? Like they're only going to get out of therapy as much as they can if they're feeling safe in the relationship.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking about the pressure that we see a lot when one parent really wants the kids to get therapy and the other parent says, you don't need therapy. Your
Yes.
other parent is acting like there's something wrong with you. And then the kid internalizes
Yep.
that and says, I don't need therapy because my other parent says you're trying to make it seem like I'm damaged or you're using me as some kind of experiment. How do you deal with that when you've got a kid who's been brainwashed to think that therapy is terrible?
So there's different ways. It's hard with kids because it's like age dependent, right? So my kids are 9, I have twins. If they were walking into therapy, and I'm thinking of mine personality and saying that, I would probably address it from a place of like, hey, therapy's not for everybody, but while you're here, I want you to know this. This isn't a place where you have to talk about your mom, where you have to talk about your dad or anything that goes on with them. If you want to, cool. If not, how was your day at school? How are your friends? Do you play sports? What makes you feel really good? Because there's so much other stuff going on. And I think this is so hard when you have parents who are in a really, really tough separation. There's still a whole life that these kids are having that isn't directly tied to a separation, and letting them know. And that works for older kids too. Like, you don't have to talk about that. I'm not going to force you because it's not going to work. If you want to come in here, tell me about the boy you like. Tell me about the teacher who didn't give you a good grade, even though you said you studied. Like, tell me about all those other things because it all, right? Whole system, it's all working together.
Hmm. I mean, as you're saying that, I'm thinking it's really about building trust. When
100.
a kid's world is crumbling, and I might have told you this when we met first. I don't remember, but I'll say it again. When my kids were dealing with the aftermath of my difficult separation from their father, they both had therapists, and one for my son. My son was a teenager at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and I found this guy. I don't even know how I found him, but he was amazing. He was like this
Oh, yeah.
former like Hell's Angel type. He came riding. He had dropped out of high school and then he had 2 master's degrees. Riding in on this big motorcycle, big guy
Yeah.
would go in and they would talk about nothing to do with family stuff. They would talk about chess and debate
Yeah.
and current events and the therapist talked to me a little bit about it and I was like, well, when are you going to get like
Yeah.
are we wasting time because it's been months and I kept thinking that the way that my world was because I was so consumed with it that it must be the same way for my son. But I think
Wasn't.
obviously you're right. Like my son had a whole life, which was great, that
Yeah.
had nothing to do with that. And also the therapist said he needs time and this is how we're establishing our relationship. And it was so helpful and it really worked out because there was a strong bond between them. And I just had to stay out of it.
Yeah. Isn't that so hard?
Yeah. I mean, it
So
got
hard.
easy because I
Yeah.
trusted him too. And
Yeah.
I felt like our son was in such good hands that it was fine.
Amazing. It's
And
also
but that was
too
something
like,
the therapist communicated with me. Like he wasn't rude about it, but he explained what he was doing. And so I naturally was able to stay out of it. But I
yeah.
was worried at the beginning, like, is this
Oh,
doing anything?
I'm sure. Because you think you're right, right? And this is one of the bigger things. And this goes for divorce, separation, trauma. The way we experience things is not always the way that kids experience it, right? And that's such a hard thing to wrap around, like to wrap your head around. I remember when I had children who were victims of sexual assault or, some kind of violent crime, like barring the violence, I would say, like, you have to understand this might not have been a violent, traumatic experience for them. Wrong,
Mm-hmm.
100%. We are very upset, but they're going to look to you to figure out how they're responding to this. So
Mm-hmm.
if you freak out, because naturally, right, if your kid is sexually assaulted, it's like end of the world, but it wasn't always the worst thing. And that goes for, and to scale it down, like, it's not that separation isn't bad or traumatic or horrible, but the kids might not be experiencing it in the same way. And I remember we said this is one of the harder things too, is like they might be an awful partner to you. they might be an awful part, like co-parent, parenting, spouse, awful to you. They might not be that way for their kids, which is like such
That's
a hard
very
dynamic.
hard.
Like that's like a
Very
really
hard.
hard thing to let
Mm.
live in that space, but like their relationship might not be what yours and your spouse's is. And that's hard, right? And
It's
then having to
really
give
hard.
space for that is like, okay, like you want them to be at your soccer game. Okay, like, all right, I will work our way through this, right? And I know for some people it's impossible, but for others, like that's a struggle and it's ongoing because they're not going to disappear, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is like a huge controversy in this community is that if someone's an abuser, how could they not abuse children? If they abuse me, then that's who they are.
Yeah.
How could they be okay as a parent? So I think it's good to hear the perspective of professionals like you who are like, actually, that's not always the case.
I mean, you could argue that by nature of being abusive, they are not a good parent because right, exposing to toxicity and that. But if the way they're showing up for the kids and the kids feels like he always shows up for me, he always comes to my game, he, makes sure that I have the things that I need and doesn't talk to me the way that he talks to somebody else. Like it is a different dynamic. It's a different person. It's a different dynamic. But that's a really hard thing to live in, right? Like,
Mhm.
and it is. Um, but yeah, I think, one of the things that helps with kids too, and made me think of this when you said he was like rolling on a Harley and they were talking about like
Yeah, yeah.
nothing to do with anything is like one of our therapists, she's also an art therapist, she has like a basketball hoop in her room. And the
Hmm.
kids will like stand around and shoot, it's like the Nerf ball and shoot the baskets. And it goes to like if they're drawing or creating or playing with the dollhouse, their brains are not tied to don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything. Right.
Hmm.
And it gives them that space to like, yeah, I love this therapist. I can go hang out and we shoot hoops and she asks me how my day was. And there's something to that of like, it's still important that their day is important,
Hmm.
that it's not tied just to the separation, right? Like they're still having difficulties at school, not understanding homework, friend stuff. Who isn't having friend stuff at any given point, right? And like it's important that someone acknowledges that for them. And sometimes that can be hard for the parent going through it of like, this is the
Hmm.
most important thing. How
Yeah.
can this not be the most important thing? But for your kid, it might be like, my best friend at school today told me she didn't want to play with me. And is she not my friend anymore? Like, why do I feel this big, big emotion? And what do I do about that? So
Hmm.
having a therapist who's like, come in and talk what you want to talk about is great. It gets a little tricky when it's court mandated and, they're looking for supporting evidence in favor of like custody or whatever the case. But we try to always be clear with especially the kids advocates of we'll tell you, you know, basic guidelines, but I'm not telling you everything that this kid is coming in and talking to us about. That's not what this is for, right? Because then that's just using us as another tool in the separation. And that can be a tricky line and it can feel like parents want it to go one way or the other and kids sometimes hold on to that like I know my mom wants me to say this so I should say this, right? But giving them that space I think is most important and then they have the space to talk about what they need to.
Yeah. So going back to something you just said about how the way that you react, your kids look to you to see
Yeah.
how they should feel. I think about when our kids are really little and they
Hmm.
fall and a lot of times
Yep.
it's like, you're okay, like you're
Yep.
fine, let's get up and everything's fine because they immediately look at you. But if you're like,
Hmm.
oh no, 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 then of course they fall apart. So
Yep.
the way that you respond, that energy that you emanate, they pick up on.
Hmm. It's so hard in like let's say a parent doesn't show up for something, a visit, right? It's so easy to be like, oh, of course, right? That's what they always do. That's who they are. But if you take a step back for a second, right? It's like, oh, you must be really disappointed. I know you were looking forward to that, right? That's so hard to do when you're like this MFer, right?
Right, 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 like
Like
all the
again, like
time.
one more time, like again, like why do we do this, right? But like if you give them that, and it's not assigning a feeling, they might not be disappointed. They might be like, oh, thank God I can go to the movies now, or,
Yeah.
whatever.
Right.
But like giving them the space for that, like, oh, that's a bummer, right? I wish he had shown up for you,
Or
or
is it
she.
a bummer?
I, well, for that, but that's right. For
Yeah.
you,
How you
definitely
feel?
not.
Yeah, right.
But for them, it might be,
Yeah.
and that's hard. Yeah.
Yeah. So, speaking of conflict, and I think I told you like our recent book just came out, When Your
Yes.
Ex Turns
Yes.
the Kids Against You. And so alienation is a huge thing in our world of high
Yeah.
conflict separation and custody battles.
Mhm.
How impactful is that conflict when it comes to alienation? I know, you talked about some things that you had seen as a therapist over the years, and
Yeah.
how something that happens now isn't just now,
Yeah.
it influences their lives.
Yeah. It's tricky because you don't want to like sit in a therapy session and be like, well, you're wrong. You shouldn't say that. It's clear that somebody told you to say that, right? Because they're doing what they think is the right thing, right? Kids aren't, I mean, once they get to a certain age, but they're not that sophisticated to like emotionally manipulate the information that they're giving you, right? It's like hard for them to do that unless someone's like, well, don't forget to say this, right? And I understand it. I think, especially in cases of abuse, you want to make sure that they're safe and that there's nothing that could endanger them, or like substance abuse. You want to make sure, like, don't forget to say, last time you saw them, that they were, tripping over their feet or slurring their words. But mimic, like, parroting information that a parent wants you to tell, like, well, don't forget, your mother never buys groceries, right? Or don't forget, daddy never shows up for you, to tell that. It creates a space where, like, at some point kids are going to be adults, right? Or even less than that, teenagers, like, oh, that was not entirely accurate, or maybe it was for my mom but like not for me, and now I don't have a relationship with that person potentially, and I'm also kind of mad at you now too, right? And like then it's a whole other situation of like, why did you do that, right? And it
Yeah.
does sometimes fall into like, I want the best for you, I was looking out for you, but like that's a really hard thing to overcome and like walk back from. And we see it all the time. Listen, we see it all the time, even in divorces that aren't highly contentious. There's like a little bit of, talking about the other parent, and it might not feel bad, but the way kids hear it is so different, right?
Yeah,
So,
I remember that you were talking about situations with conflict where maybe a kid was thinking back on how when they were younger, like the police are coming for an exchange and there's a kid texting, the other
yeah,
parent, and then, it just becomes like this huge thing. Well, I mean, that happens a lot, unfortunately, with our
all the
community,
time.
because around exchanges, it's like I have to see the person. What is the impact of that kind of stuff and kids being in the middle of that physical situation where like police are involved and I've got to call my other parent?
Yeah. If you think about it in a like, how does it make you feel, right? So like, I'm an adult, and the idea of having to go to a police station to do a handoff for a weekend, and knowing that there's a potential for conflict, even with not getting out of the car, my anxiety is going to shoot up, right? And
Mhm.
now you have younger kids, middle school age kids, high school kids, and high school kids are probably better at like hiding their anxiety, right? Like, oh, here we go again. But like the anxiety that surrounds that, then you're creating anxiety about driving to the police station. Is
Mhm.
something going to happen? How is this going to fall out? Is the rest of my visit going to be, somebody's upset and calling, nonstop, calling my phone nonstop, right? It's just this like potential for such a stressful environment. And unfortunately, in some cases, it needs to be, right? Like you need to go to the police station to do the handoff because it's been so bad in the past. I get that. But thinking about like, using your kids as a tool in that moment is never going to work out well. It's never going to work out well for you. It's never going to work out well for the kids. It's not going to work out well for the other spouse, right? Like, it's not helpful to them in any way to be like, oh my God, this is wrong. Call the police.
Mm.
Because you're asking them to call the police on their parent, right?
Yeah.
And listen, if the police need to be called, the police need to be called. That's not what I'm saying. But like, don't use the kids as a tool to like muddy the waters of an exchange. That's a really, really hard thing to continue to go through, right? And if your kids are young enough, you have what, 10, 15 years of this to keep doing it. Now you think like multiply that anxiety, that stress, right?
Yeah.
How much are they going to be focused on schoolwork on Friday, knowing they have to go to the police station and there's a potential you might have to call, like that's a sometimes unavoidable, but not using them as a tool would be probably the best thing possible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it makes sense. And it's something to think about when we put together a parenting plan. So
Yeah.
even though you say I'll feel safe, to consider the impact it will have on your
Yes,
children and their association with police, not as
100%.
something to protect you, but as like, I don't want
Hmm.
to be anywhere near that because of
Yeah.
something in my childhood. Yeah. So the other thing I was thinking about is often when kids are in the middle of these highly conflictual situations, they tell something to one parent, and then the
Hmm.
parent says, "Well, my kid says this," and they tell a different thing to the other parent,
Hmm.
which each parent finds very hard to believe
Yeah.
that the kid would not be telling the other parent the same thing they're telling them. And then when there's some kind of evaluation
Yeah.
and the evaluator comes back and says the kid says they're okay with both parents, like each parent flips out and goes, no, that's not what they said.
Yeah.
Can you tell us your perspective as a therapist with kids and telling the truth?
Sure. I think that is the truth in that moment, right? If I am talking to a child who enjoys spending time with their dad because they go for bike rides and they play soccer and they take the dog on a walk and their time together is not terrible, then when their dad says, "Oh, do you like having time with me? Do you want to do more time with me?" and they say, "Yes," that's not a lie. And
Mm,
then if they turn around and go home and like home with mom is, snuggles on the couch and watching movies and maybe more reading at bedtime, or, mom, make sure you always have your favorite snack. And mom says, "Well, you want to spend more time with me? Right? Like this is nice." And they say yes, it's not a lie then either. It's just in both those situations, they're telling the truth, but also leaning into like, yeah, this is what I like. This is how I like to be, right? Of course, I want to spend more time with you. You're my parent. When the evaluation happens and they're like, "Oh, well, I really like time with my dad and I really like time with my mom. So I want to see them both." And I hear that thinking, like, "But you just said you wanted to spend more time with me.
mm-hmm,
Like, what do you mean? You said," but they didn't. And hopefully they're not saying, "Well, you want to spend more time with me, not daddy, right? Or you want to spend more time with me, not mom, because mom is like, whatever,
mm-hmm,
right?" That's a different situation. But like, kids typically are telling the truth in those scenarios, right? And I think that's why a child advocate can be so helpful of like, all right, we're going to be fully objective here. You tell me what you want.
mm-hmm,
But when a kid is spending time with somebody, and you'll know, right? There's always the kids. I mean, I can think of kids that were like 7 years old and they're like, "I do not want to go. I don't
mm-hmm.
want to go for that overnight."
All the
And they were
time, all the time.
7, but like it was another 5 years before they could have the choice to go or not, right? And
Mm-hmm,
nothing terrible, the one I'm thinking of in particular, nothing terrible, but like nothing great either,
mm-hmm,
right? And so it wasn't that there was like abuse or, the situation was dangerous. It was just that it wasn't home and it wasn't home
mm-hmm,
with mom, right? And they were so closely tuned into mom. Um, but when a kid is like, "Yeah, I like spending time with you and I like spending time with my mom," that's probably the truth, right? And we have to
yeah,
give kids, I mean, and this is the thing I have to, remind parents of, like, you have to let them tell you their truth. Like you have to be open to the idea that like their truth is different than your truth and like or what you want it to be, right? I get that. I cannot imagine having to split up time with my kids. And so of course I would want them all the time, but they might not want that.
yeah, and that is so hard that their truth is different from your truth because we think we're so close that
Yeah.
both feel the same way, and often we don't. So speaking of that, being close and being too close, tell us about
Mhm.
parentification. What does that mean, and why is that a problem?
So, parentification is when a child begins to take on a lot of the roles of an adult, right? And so, what I would say we see most often in especially like high conflict divorces like this and separations is there's a lot of feeling responsible for other people's emotions,
Mm-hmm,
right? And so, mom just got off the phone with dad and she's super upset. Like, what can I do right now to make things better? I'll make her a cup of tea, or I'll, make sure that she has the things that she needs. Or, "Here, mommy, I brought you your favorite book. Do you want to sit and snuggle?" Right? And like parentifying this child who could be as young as 5, 6, 7, through teenagers, right? Of like, okay, if I do X, Y, and Z, then everybody will be here. So
mm-hmm,
how do I achieve that, right? It it's dangerous because, or not dangerous, it's not good for somebody because a 5-year-old is a 5-year-old and they shouldn't have to worry about the emotional regulation of me as an adult, right? That's far too complicated for them and far too heavy a responsibility for them. They should be able to worry about the things that they're worried about. which is not to say you can't raise empathetic kids, right? Like,
Mhm.
yeah, if someone's upset, for sure, check in on them. Are you okay? Can I help? But it's not your responsibility. You cannot ever be responsible, even as adults. I can't be responsible for people's emotions and their emotional state. Like, I can be a friend, I can be a support, I can be your therapist, but I can't singularly be in charge of how you feel and whether or not you're happy. That's a big ask for a kid, really big, and turns into, as you get older, when you are so conditioned or so used to making sure that everything is like status quo with the people in your life, it has a tendency to skew towards anxiety, right? And people pleasing and like not really having the boundaries or ability to stand up for yourself and be like, I totally get that you're sad and frustrated right now. I would love to help you if I could, but I'm not going to be able to. Like, do you have any ideas, right? Or being able to step away when there's something that's like, ooh, there's a lot of red flags here. If you have, oh, right, even in like relationships, thinking about as kids age, like if you have always been someone who picks up on the theme of the room, or the emotional status of the room, and like, how can I fix this, you're not necessarily going to notice when a partner has some red flags, right?
Mhm.
Demanding too much of your time, or expecting you not to talk to other people, or whatever the case may be. It might be like, oh well, if I do that thing, then everything's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like kids, as they grow older, are drawn to what's familiar because it's normal. So do you want them to have that unhealthy relationship dynamic?
Yeah.
Yeah. So go ahead.
No, go ahead.
All right. I was going to say, so before we end, are there any ideas of what good questions would be for someone to know, okay, this is a good therapist. I need to find a
Yes.
good therapist for my kid.
So when we do intakes for children, we always keep in mind a little bit of like, this is a parent, so we're not getting the full story, right? Because like even for young children, you're not getting the entire full story. But we tend to ask like, what kind of personality does your kid have? Are they, someone who gets really comfortable and likes to talk and like has no problem talking to strangers, or whatever the case may be? Like, they can go with a variety of people. Is your kid a little bit more quiet? Are they a little bit more reserved? Does it take them time to warm up to people? They might do better with someone like one of our therapists, who works with kids, is an art therapist, right? And
Mhm.
so they spend a lot of time in this creative space, which is such a great medium for kids to express themselves. You don't have to be good at art, right? You have to be willing to do something and engage with it, because it's about the process, not the product.
Mhm.
We have other therapists. One is really great at play therapy, right? Is your kid younger? Do they feel comfortable coming in and playing in a room with somebody?
Mhm.
Um, does your kid tend to roll your eyes when you talk to them, right? And kind of space out? They might do better with somebody who's less talking and more, whether it's creative art therapy, music therapy, drama therapy, right? Like thinking about like, and for kids, you can be like, who is the teacher that they had the best connection with? And what
Mhm.
are those qualities? Did they have a ton of structure? Did they have a sense of warmness, supportness? Were they younger? Were they a little bit older, right? What in that relationship, what in that dynamic was there so that maybe they have a better connection, but it's still going to take time, right? Like
Mhm.
you're, it is exceptionally rare. I can think of in my entire career and the clients we have, maybe two kids who've walked in on the first session and be like, oh my God, I'm so glad to be here. I have so much to tell you. How much time do we have? Right? Like it's very, very rare that kids will come in and do that. If they're a little bit more trepidatious, they don't, always know why they're there. And so it's a lot of education, but it's a lot of just giving them space. Like, come in, see the room. What's in here? Ask me any questions that you like. Like I share with my therapist now, like we're told not to share, right? Nothing about our personal lives. Kids are curious. You can't
Mhm.
just, oh, well, you're here about you, right? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like,
this is not about me. They're like, what? Like, what do you, like, what do you
yeah, and the
mean?
trust thing, like, well, why should I tell you my deepest secrets? And you're just like a wall.
It's true. But really understanding, like, as impatient as you are, to have them fixed, whatever that is defined as for you, it's probably going to take longer. It's going to take longer for them to get comfortable with the therapist, to really develop a relationship where they can walk in and be like, I had the worst week of my life. Or something
Mhm.
scarier, right? Like, I'm feeling like I'm not safe at home, or I'm feeling like I'm not safe with myself, right? That's hard. That's a hard thing to, it's a hard thing for adults to open up and say, imagine
Yeah.
how much harder when kids don't have the capacity to fully understand the implications of their emotions or their words,
And
right?
they can't get out.
Yeah.
It's like for an adult to talk about it, then you can make a plan. A kid, what are you going to do with them?
Yeah, it's hard. It's really, really hard. But yeah, I would say thinking about the personality that they might respond well to and ask questions about that, right? Do intake calls, like take the free 15. If people have a 15-minute call, take it. Talk to them, get a sense of who they are, right? If there's something in that conversation that's like, oh, you remind me of that gym teacher they really great. Start there. But
Hmm.
explain to the kid and to the therapist, like, let's give it a month, let's give it 2 months, let's see how they are, right? If they're fighting to come back after 2 months, it's probably not the right fit or the right time, which can be
Hmm.
hard if they're mandated into therapy,
Yeah.
right?
I just thought of one more thing that comes up a lot. Parents wanting to have lots of intel from the therapist where like and especially during custody battle is
Yeah.
like I want to know, I need updates, I need reports. How do you
Mhm.
as a therapist feel when parents are really involved? Because I interviewed a therapist once who was like, the best thing I got was a judge making a court order that neither parent
Yeah,
could contact
I
me.
bet. I understand it. I understand the want for that information, the want to know if the kid has shared anything that um, threatens their safety or helps their case, right? Um, and we do a lot of, and it's a lot of reaffirming for parents of like, listen, if there's something you need to know, we'll stop the session and bring you in, right?
Hmm.
If they're going to hurt themselves, if they're going to go home and hurt themselves, you're coming in. We're going to make a plan right then and there. Um, but it has to be a space where they feel comfortable sharing. Otherwise, they're not going to share. And that
Yeah.
may mean the update is like, hey, they came in today and they actually sat down and talked for a little while before they played a game, or we played a game and then stopped before we usually do. Then we just talked. That's great progress. And
Yeah.
not always like, hey, they came in and they talked about like how dad drove them to a gas station and then they went here and then they went there and they didn't get home until I can't
Okay.
share that information. No child in their right mind is going to trust someone who tells every single thing and every single detail, right?
Yeah. Makes sense.
So, yeah.
All right. So Ahimsa, how can people find you?
Oh, they can follow our Instagram. They can go to pleasantvillewellnessgroup.com. We have all our information there. We are able to offer in-network pricing for a couple of insurance plans, which I know is always a big thing. So we're in New York State, so NYSHIP, United Healthcare, and Oxford. If you have those insurances, we're able to offer it's same pricing as in-network, which we
Is it
find really
only New York or any other states?
we have some therapists who are licensed elsewhere, so it would
Mhm.
depend on what state they're in. Yeah, for sure, but it's worth calling and finding out. I mean, we have people who are tri-county, we have people who are licensed in Florida, Missouri, maybe, I think. So it's definitely worth giving a call and finding out. But yeah, so they can come to our website, follow our Instagram. We're always around.
Yes. Well, thank you so much,
Of
Ahimsa,
course.
for this
Thank you
awesome
for
talk.
having me
You know,
on.
you'll be back because I always get lots of questions
Okay,
about this.
definitely. Happy to come back anytime.
Yes, and hope to see you at one of the lunches soon.
Oh, yes. Not tomorrow, but maybe next month.
Okay, sounds
All
good.
right.
All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye.